Bum, 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 bum.
You're listening to Tove, a podcast about the good place and Jewish ideas. Hey, everyone. It's good to be back here with Rabbi Rebecca Rosenthal. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, for those who've been listening to these as they've been coming out, it's been actually a little more than a month since we have recorded and published. And so I appreciate you waiting for us to catch up. And so, should we jump in? This is chapter 8, Most Improved Player. You want to give us a summary, Rebecca?
Sure. In the aftermath of Eleanor's confession, Michael summons her for an interview to determine if she is in fact a good or a bad person. Janet is still glitchy after her post-murder reboot and fulfills Michael's request for Eleanor's file with a series of cacti. So Michael begins conducting a litmus test, asking a series of questions as whether she has ever committed murder or reheated fish in an office microwave. When Janet finally finds Eleanor's file, Eleanor is forced to tell the damaging dress bitch t-shirt story, leading Michael to summon Trevor from the bad place. And I like that Trevor is wearing the dress bitch t-shirt when he goes to pick her up. The rest of the group tries to vouch for Eleanor in various ways, but it's only when Chidi gives Michael his own confession and says that Eleanor has been learning that Michael decides to stop Trevor from taking her away immediately. As the episode ends, Trevor brings out the real Eleanor Shellstrop.
All right. Well, so did you have any great favorite parts of this episode?
You know, this episode felt like more transitional than other episodes. Like, not really that much happens here. We sort of end in a similar place to where the episode began, which is unusual, at least for the ones that I have talked about with you on this podcast. I think the previous episode, which I was also talking to you about, right? The ending is Eleanor's confession, and that's like a big moment. And so here we're really playing out the aftermath. But I love Michael's tests about like whether you ever went to a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert or took off your shoes and socks on an airplane. I thought like it, he goes from these big serious things to these small things, but some of the small things in our everyday life, especially if we don't thankfully encounter murder in our everyday life, right? We encounter some of these people and you're just like, oh, those people are the worst, right? When people do things like reheat fish in an office microwave. I thought that was like just really funny. And I just love that Chidi was so proud of Eleanor for citing Kant, and that he's in this moment of such deep turmoil. And he's a true teacher in a lot of ways, because he's like, oh my God, my student learned something. And that's so great. That's like even better than anything I could ask for, is that my student learned. And I felt that along with him. I feel that when I teach students, it's like, oh, did they learn something? I have succeeded.
And actually, yeah, because it sort of reframes his perspective. I think like when you can see that learning, it almost makes you more forgiving. It seems like that's going on both with him and also Michael, who seems so tormented in the course of the episode, even though like you would think he'd be sort of satisfied when he finally gets to the bottom of things, but he's not. He's become sort of invested in someone who seems to be learning. And I just going back to what I was saying before, I think that when I encounter things in certainly in the wider community, when I see people at a distance who seem infuriating in the local political world, I just want to sort of jump and join the screaming sometimes. But if I encounter them and there seems to be some moment of perhaps movement or coming towards something, or things we talk about that surprise them or surprise me, then it kind of throws me in a different direction.
I think one thing that's like so rich about this show is that you see Michael and Chidi be impressed by Eleanor's learning. And then and we could talk about this, in the second season, but once you learn about what the twist is, it puts Michael in a whole new light, right? And everything that he's talking about in this particular moment in a completely different light. And it's like so fascinating to think about. I don't know, but did the writers know that was coming? And is this really just like a secret way of signaling to us what's going to happen in the future? Or is this really just like an amazing coincidence? I think the writers are brilliant. So I think they knew, and we're setting us up here.
It is true. And that, I mean, in a way, it makes Michael's actions a little more troubling, because if he's really trying to, if his expression of sincerity and even loyalty toward Eleanor is part of as part of his whole twisted torture act. That doesn't seem good at all. But on its own terms, before you know that, it seems kind of interesting.
I mean, I think this other moment that really stood out to me was just sort of as you said, like Michael's particular torture, as he said, confronting your greatest failure. That when Eleanor is sitting in front of him, he's just his great failure is right there in his face, and I don't think any of us like to go around in the world thinking about how, being followed by our greatest failure. Thinking about people. It makes me think about like Hillary Clinton when she wandered in the woods after the election, right? Like you have to figure out a way to get away from it because you don't want your failure to be there every day staring at you in the face.
It's funny. This is perhaps you are more high-minded than I, because I, who granted am living in New England right now, think of greatest failure. The Red Sox are in the playoffs as we record this, and probably the most famous moment of failure in World Series history was Bill Buckner's fumbling of the ground ball, which converted basically a World Series victory into World Series loss. And I was thinking actually about sports where, your score, it's really the only other realm where you have this kind of real-time accounting, your statistics of success and failure, and then you're just like at Michael's thing here with the file that has your greatest moment and your worst moment. Like that's definitely your reel of highlights and bloopers is very real in especially in baseball, I think, of all the sports.
Yeah, I think, in a lot of sports, because it has to give the commentator something to do. Like, how many times on a Tuesday have you done this thing? And, how many times have someone who's, 32 years old done this other thing? And so the idea of tallying up your successes and failures is a big part of sports. I wouldn't really know, but that's what they tell me.
So I think we've established that sports and Star Trek are two things that you don't immerse
but
in.
I live in a house with some sports fans, some Red Sox fans and some Dodgers fans.
Ooh.
So everyone is keeping their hope alive right now in the current playoff situation.
Well, I totally agree with you about this kind of transitional episode. It was really interesting to go back after a few weeks of not watching intensely to this. And I just sort of by chance of what was going on at home invited my 14-year-old who hasn't been like a dedicated Good Place person to watch this episode, and she was like the perfect companion because all the gags, all the slapstick stuff she just loved. The whole thing about Janet and the cactus, everything's a cactus, and definitely the people taking off their shoes and socks, on airplanes. I think Trevor's thing at the end, that they can finish it up so you can go back to putting rainbows up your butt. Really.
Well, I don't really like socks, even though I live in a cold weather climate. But if I go on an airplane, I always wear socks because you would never take off your socks and shoes. That does send you right to the bad place. I agree.
I have heated tuna in like the office, like tuna melts in the yeah, you're shaking your head. But at home I'm not. I do the fish thing, yeah, in the microwave. I wondered as a New Yorker whether this resonated, this thing about the train, Trevor's thing about making thousands of stops for literally no reason.
I mean, I have been on trains that feel like they're endless. The one thing he could have done to really make it New York was to make completely unintelligible announcements on the train at every stop where you have no idea what they're saying, but you're sure it's important, and they're probably saying they're going to skip your stop for some reason. But I have to say, the pandemic has cleared out the transit, and it's slowly coming back, but it is very strange to be on the subway at rush hour and not be packed in like a sardine with everybody. And thankfully everyone leaves their shoes and socks on the train, because that would also be wrong.
I think that I really love this line where Michael finally has the file and asks to hear about the T-shirt story, and Eleanor says, "It doesn't make me look great. Don't judge me." And Michael says, "That's literally the purpose of this entire exercise."
When he said that, I thought to myself, like, isn't that what Yom Kippur is? I think most people feel deeply uncomfortable actually with the idea that we're going to get judged in exactly the way that Michael is judging Eleanor. And I think we think about God with God's book, and yes, you were good, and no, you were bad, and here's your good things and here's your bad things, and that Michael as God judging everything you've done. And I think that's a theology that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. This idea that somebody would be up there tallying every good and bad thing that you have done. But when we get to Yom Kippur, it's like, yeah, that's literally the point. That's, Yom Hadid, the day of judgment. That's literally what we're doing. And so I just thought like, oh, well, it's a few weeks after Yom Kippur, but the themes are universal.
Yeah, and I think actually the idea of don't judge me is also something maybe they're making fun of, because a world that had no judgment would also be terrible. I think it's really interesting that Eleanor, even in her recollection, there is a point in this whole thing with the T-shirt and the laundromat where she, even her earthly pre-good place self, realizes it's gone too far. I had this experience in when I was training at a hospital chaplaincy, where I thought that this whole, accepting non-judgmental thing was kind of the point. And I presented a situation where I retold the story of a patient I had encountered in the hospital. And the rest of the group kind of looked at me and said, like, how could you have accepted that without judgment? He told you some really terrible things that he had done, and you're so like pleased that you were there for him. And like at some point you have to judge stuff.
And Eleanor is an extremely judgmental person, right? Even in the good place, she's very judgmental. She judges Chidi, she judges Jason/Janu, she judges Tahani. I think she still judges Tahani, even, after they have kind of their bonding moment. That she really is the person who lets first impressions influence how she relates to people and what she thinks. And part of her growth is like figuring out, oh, not everybody is only what they seem on the surface, but actually you have to go deeper with people. And over the course of the series, she really does. And I know this is the theme that's come up a couple of times as we've been talking on this podcast, but just the idea of one of the themes of the show being about like Eleanor figuring out how to be in actual relationships with people and not the kinds of relationships that she was in her life.
There were a couple things where Jason is being interviewed by Michael that I wondered if they were little homages. I remember when I was really young, this movie, I think it was called, was it Being Alive? No, Being There. That's what it was, with the Peter Sellers as the gardener who is considered to have cognitive deficiencies and is around these Washington power players, and whenever they speak to him, all he can do is respond in terms of very simple gardening metaphors that they assume are profound. And eventually, I think at the end they consider him as the only person who can save the country or something like that because of his wisdom. And of course, we know this is an act of Michael's. Are you familiar with that film?
No, but it sounds really interesting. I think it's where we see the behind the scenes, if you will, of the interview where Eleanor and Cheater are like, just don't say anything. Just don't say anything. Just because they don't trust that he could possibly open his mouth and be helpful. And him opening his mouth creates a whole other domino effect, right? They can only deal with one crisis at a time. Right now, the crisis is Eleanor. And then, we layer on top of that the crisis of Chidi, and the whole thing just keeps kind of spiraling and creating bigger and bigger sinkholes, if you will. But, I was interested when Michael said, there's no such thing as mistakes in this realm, right? And that's actually ultimately what allows him to save Eleanor, Kristen Bell Eleanor, is the idea that they should keep her while they sort it out because there's no such thing as a mistake, right? We don't live in a world where that's a thing, right? We live in a world where there are constant mistakes. And so we have to learn as humans how to solve mistakes and how to move on and do tshuva, do repentance, and try again. And we learn that there are a lot of mistakes in this realm. We just don't, Michael just doesn't realize that that's what they are. But it's interesting to think about the idea that the way we construct the good place is a place without mistakes, but mistakes being such a rich way for people to learn. And so thinking about like, is it really good to live in a world where nobody ever makes a mistake?
I hadn't thought about that in connection with the episode here. It's throwing in focus for me that we seem, I think right now, to be living in a time where on the one hand there's kind of an ideology of people should make mistakes, and the world is far too complex for us to think we can get through it without doing that. And yet at least it's said that we are more intolerant of at least certain kinds of mistakes than ever before. Certainly if you're a public figure, you have no margin for error. or do-overs if you say the wrong thing or you describe something in the wrong way. I just a couple minutes ago, in trying to describe this movie and this character that Peter Sellers plays of a gardener who back in the time would have been it'd been easy to say, this is a figure of low intelligence or this is a figure is mentally retarded. And even now, I don't know, what exactly the right thing is to say when not in a. I mean, I'm talking to you, but we're talking in the presence of what I hope is literally hundreds of thousands, of people. Who
Yeah,
knows if I'll be canceled for saying the wrong thing?
well, we just had today we had a round of diversity, equity, and inclusion training at work, and one of the things that the trainer was Liz Kleinrock, who's this amazing educator, was talking about was if we spend so much time on language, we never get to the actual meat of the issue. And so she sort of said, like, these are the terms and we're going to use them, and like we're going to actually try to get actions and not just spend all of our time wordsmithing. That wordsmithing, we've lost the thread of the episode maybe, but that wordsmithing is like one of the things that prevents people from actually doing the work that they need to do. So that's not to say everyone should just go around saying everything, whatever they feel in an insensitive way, but also thinking about like what are the actions that using correct language might prompt you to do in the world.
Do you have any Jewish lens you're bringing to this episode?
The main thing I just kept thinking about over and over again was the text from the Talmud about like sort of we're going to weigh everything that you do, the good and the bad, and that one good thing can push you in one direction and one bad thing can push you in the other direction, and that you should always kind of live your life as though everything is in balance so that the next thing you do will push you over to the good, right? Because literally Michael is making a tally and eventually says to Eleanor, do you think you belong in the good place? And she sort of says like, well, maybe there should be a medium place for people like me. And we learn, in fact, there is a medium place, but that this idea that most of us walk around in the medium place, right? We don't walk around in the bad place or in the good place, but most of the time we're like fairly well balanced, and that we should live our life as though the next thing that we do could really like push us into the good place or push us into the bad place to hang out with Trevor, who seems kind of fun, but maybe like you don't want to live there forever. So, this idea that all of our actions count, right? That it's not just how many good things and how many bad things, but that each individual action counts as well.
That's interesting. There's a complexity even in the story that they decide to focus in on here, because we've definitely heard about the product whose name now I'm forgetting to remember that Eleanor sells fraudulently as her job.
Oh yeah, I forget what it is, but yeah.
Oh goodness. And so like, which I think is probably like objectively and like, it combines a complete disregard for human well-being with a zest for, cheating people and deceiving them. And this is something, the thing with the dress is seems like a garden variety thing for her. And it actually it spins way out of control, and even, past the point. Once she sells it to she sells it to herself and the roommates, and then the one roommate who takes it and runs with it and turns it into the t-shirt thing. Like that's in a way, I guess that's the we don't realize maybe that's something which is just for Eleanor a sort of regular role, and maybe not the worst thing she's ever done, quickly becomes the worst thing she's ever set in motion ever.
Right, there's one moment in that story where she is like, maybe this isn't the right thing to do, right? She has some tiny moment of self-awareness when she comes home and her roommate is there with the t-shirts, and then there's the moment where she says to Michael, like, don't ask me what I did with the money, because she goes and buys the dress. And I think the question I asked about that was like, if Eleanor took the money and gave it to charity, gave it to tzedakah, would that have redeemed the episode in some way, or is it still like really, really bad because of this public humiliation thing? And if we're talking about rabbinic text, the rabbis say that shaming someone in public is like murdering them. This idea that like when all the blood rushes to your face, it's like you're murdering someone. And we murder people every day on the internet with all of our right. It's much easier now. The public reach of shaming someone is vast. I think the question is there any way for Eleanor to have redeemed herself in this episode, right? Is giving the money to charity enough, or if she had stopped the roommate from selling it, or returned the shirts, or fessed up, like what would have been enough if she had bought the dress and then gave it to the roommate to say, like, sorry, I ruined your dress and possibly your life, right? Is there a, I think Judaism would say, like, there is a tshuva somewhere, right? You can make tshuva in some way. You can repent and do better in some way, but it's not clear to me based on the incident like what that way is. And because Eleanor makes a series of bad choices and not just one bad choice, she's not able to come back from it, and it becomes the worst thing that she's ever done.
Yeah, I'm very glad that they didn't try to do that actually. When Trevor, as you say, comes back and the gang, they have the dress bitch t-shirts that it's like reverberated to eternity as like
And
a
they're bedazzled, which is just extra fun.
that, that I think that's a way of saying like even if like they probably would wear that T-shirt even if she had figured out a way to start the dress bitch, girls empowerment foundation or something. It still would not.
Right.
That's the Mindy Sinclair question we'll deal with in in a few weeks, I guess.
How do you get to the medium place, right? And I think we can ask this question later, but like, do you want to be in the medium place? Because I think the Talmud would say like most of us are in the medium place.
Well, the other thing that you're pointing out, I think, is that the our action, a single action, it's a fallacy to try to assess us action by action and score points because the tally on any action isn't really in for a while till we see where it leads. I do agree with you in the sense that it is possible that she could have redirected this so it would have been, less horrible. But clearly, you can't just go by that. It's a floating situation. And in a way, I mean, I think, the whole, as you're saying, the whole thing about Eleanor is that since she doesn't really take her relationships that seriously, even with these people she seems to like to hang out with, there's no, not even just a feedback loop, but there's no like safety net. There's nothing that could have caught her, nothing she would have listened to kind of early on that would have constrained her.
Or like her roommate is just as bad or possibly worse, right? Not the dress one, but the one who works with her to make the t-shirts and all of that, right? When Eleanor expresses some reservations about this plan that they have, the roommate basically says like, look how much money we got. And they just go on and on. And Eleanor, when she expresses some reservations earlier, the roommate says, well, she's such a terrible person, right? Mm. That as bringing us back to the earlier conversation about being judgmental, right? That when we, and people say it all the time, I am guilty of it too, right? Oh, that person's terrible. That person's awful. Do we really mean that, right? Is anybody really all terrible? Or I would say most people are not all terrible. How can we find that thing inside of people that would help us think about them as more human and not as completely one thing or completely another?
I think that, this episode does turn on it being demonstrable that Eleanor has done some things that are true. She has not murdered or directly done things like that, but that she has quantifiable awful things, on her life resume, and it kind of has to be that way. And we've talked, I think, before that the writers, of course, made her likable or even lovable in certain ways. That we don't want that to be the last part of the story. It's challenging, but I think we have to take seriously that she has. Can't just accept her on the terms that she presents herself. For me, the thing that was the angle in, and I was like you were saying, thinking about how sort of staying in place the episode is it made me think about how much of this is about the active confession. And I was thinking about this from a couple points of view, that when Maimonides, who I've called, Judaism's least funny rabbi ever, introduces the idea of tshuva, the very first thing he talks about is confession. I'll put the actual text in the notes here, but that verbalizing confession, even if it's just before God or before the divine, however you see that, is the essential first thing you have to do, even before you start dealing with apology to another person or the actual demonstration of repair. And you have to name the thing. You have to name that you are regretful and ashamed, and as well as your commitment. And that shouldn't be a perfunctory thing, is the way Maimonides puts it. And I've been thinking for a long time about the fact that in Hebrew, the same root word describes confession, vidui, and also acknowledgement, like just saying things as they actually are. So confessing can even be describing something, you did well, carefully. And it's the same word as gratitude, toda. That's a whole other kind of thing. And I realized that in a way this whole episode is Eleanor's confession, and she's not doing it. She has talked about things, or she has laughed at bad things that she's done that she's flashed back on before, but this is the first time she seems so ashen about it, and that she has someone to tell it to, like, just sort of straight up. I mean, it's in the file. She has no, although Michael, it's not exactly in the file. Like, Michael has the points about it, has sort of the main points, but really requires her to enunciate it. And I really have been thinking about, like, I never really understood why confession, outside of apology was important, right? She's not talking to her roommates about this. She's talking to somebody else who's observing. And I think I started to get that, like, that's maybe the only kind of pure moment where, it's that moment of holding where, like, you can't start repairing it yet. You're in that uncomfortable place where you have to just say it. I've been thinking about, as soon as you start apologizing, you put pressure on the other person to, like, say it's okay, or I accept, or you force them to say, no, that's not good enough. And this, it's a sort of a holding place. And I think that, so this is probably the longest monologue I've had in the whole podcast, that my worry has been that Judaism compared to, say, an ethical philosophy doesn't add anything at all into the picture. It just dresses up what we've been talking about at a different name. But I think, and I'm not saying uniquely Judaism, but I think this idea that there is this practice and this way station that you can't describe. I mean, the value of the confession, it doesn't have any action or point value really in and of itself. You can't. I mean, unless you want to judge it by what it leads you to afterwards. But I thought it was really very powerful. And Trevor taunts Eleanor by saying, like, you have such a beautiful smile. Why aren't you smiling? To kind of remind us just how much she's not smiling. And her not smiling through all this is, like, probably the biggest breakthrough of the whole thing, even though she knows at the moment it's going to take her to the bad place.
But I think there's another breakthrough in this that what you were just saying reminds me of, which is, Michael has that cube, which I think a lot of parents would enjoy having in their house. He asks Eleanor, do you know who killed Janet? And she says yes, and it lights up green. And then he says, are you going to tell me? And she says no, and it lights up green. And it's as though there's sort of some sort of independent thing in the universe verifying that Eleanor knows that tattling is worse than confessing, right? That telling Michael that it was Chidi is going to be both a violation of Chidi, but also somehow wrong for the situation, that she needed to confess that she was in the bad place. In the previous episode, she couldn't have Chidi or someone do it for her. And Chidi, for his own stomach aches, is going to have to eventually confess that he's the one who kills Janet, and that Eleanor can't really do it for him. And I think when that thing lights up green, it's sort of an affirmation that Eleanor is like, I'm going to protect Chidi. I'm going to protect Chidi until he's ready to do this thing that I've already done, which is to confess. And that by lighting up green, Michael knows, like, well, there's no point in pushing her because this objective machine has said, she's not going to tell me. So I can ask and ask, but she's not going to tell me, right? It knows the future as well as the present.
Right. And then the sense of confession as acknowledgement that this is who she is. She's established herself on a moral basis as the person who would not, who would continue to stand by Chidi. She has her reasons for that. She's not doing it in a Kantian sense, as she described it. This is what she's taking responsibility for. Now that you're saying about, you mentioned stomachache, that when Chidi does come to Michael after they've all tried to persuade him to keep her around, he doesn't look very stomach-achy at all. In fact, I don't think he's very clear. He confesses everything that he's done, and then he explains that Eleanor, when she learned about what your retirement, Michael, was going to mean for you, this is the reason she murdered Janet, and she is learning. And he seems so earnest. There's not any of that exasperated, vexed Chidi in that moment. And even when Michael throws it back to him, this is not Little League, that Chidi kind of stands there. He stands up. It's in what seems like a very not Chidi-like moment there, but it almost seems easy for him to do that.
Yeah, because I think if you can sort of untangle yourself enough, that confession can be freeing. right? The truth will set you free, as they say. That Chidi, he literally gets a stomachache from this kind of thing. And the only way to rid yourself of the stomachache is by saying what you did. And I think harkening back to episode 7 with Eleanor, you can see it in that episode. She looks pained until she stands up and says, like, I can't take it anymore. It was me. I don't belong in this place. And that living with the kinds of lies and deception that they're living with can cause you like actual physical pain, as opposed to in addition to whatever emotional or metaphysical pain and Kantian pain you're being caused by these things. But that the confession, even if it sets off a series of really difficult events, like might eventually lead you, no pun intended, to the good place or to a good place.
I find this, hard to do, as a fixer or someone who wants people to feel better or to be better. I find it hard to stay in that uncertainty of confession just for its own, I don't know, not for its own sake, but confession, knowing that you don't know the result. I mean, in the moment, Chidi doesn't know whether, is this going to lead him to be sent away? Like, what does it mean for any of them? None of them are certain. If anything, Eleanor is certain that this is the end of her. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't sound exactly ring true as being like courageous, but it does seem like a significant change.
And I think that's also one of the things that comes up a lot in this series, but also when thinking about sort of this idea that each of your actions could rebalance the scales in a different way, which is that, let's say, if you confess and you don't know what the consequences are, right? They could be really bad or they could be really good. And sometimes you have to figure out like what is the right thing, and what is going to be sort of a more global right thing, even if you don't necessarily know which way it's going to rebalance the scales, or whether you're going to get sent to the bad place, or whatever the possible options are. Right? Chidi doesn't know when he, as you said, when he confesses, that that's going to be the chain of events that saves Eleanor for the time being. Mm. But he does it because it's the right thing to do.
I'm thinking about something that happened to me very early in my career, where I was guilty of kind of workplace gossip in a way that was common in my workplace and was common, I think, for me at that time. And there was a particular instance where something I said got around to in a way that I didn't think was going to, and it turned out to be hurtful to my boss, who was a person who was on the whole very good to me, and I expressed a frustration and a criticism, that of the sort that I commonly would back at that time. And so it took until it actually had the bad effect for me to really realize how bad it was and to confess. I had to both to confess, to apologize to her, and also it was the moment actually that woke me up to teshuva for myself. That's the moment where I resolved that I wasn't going to do that kind of thing anymore. But I didn't know until it cascaded. I didn't really know that I had done a wrong thing. And like maybe it would have been good if I had known ahead of time, or if I had confessed, earlier to anybody. But I think it's also okay that Eleanor doesn't really get, she starts by spinning this as like this great thing she did for, who was it? Who was it to the churro dog? Niece or something like that. I just watched this the other day. I should know who it was. But anyway, it started off as a good thing, but she didn't realize it was it obviously wasn't clearly a really bad thing with the dress until it became even worse than it was. And I think it's okay that you at any stage on the process, including when the dust is settled, it's still okay to confess and to start from that point.
Churro dog, yes or no?
Oh, I don't know. I think isn't it like super spicy, or am I confused? Oh no, churros
are like those. They're sweet. They're like donuts, but not donuts.
I'm thinking chorizo, I think. So yes. Yeah, I probably could. How about you?
I don't think so. I mean, I'll eat a hot dog, but I don't know that I want it also with a churro and beef jerky. That feels like maybe a few too many things in one thing. But Eleanor says it's really good.
I mean, if you put it in the microwave with some fish, it's really great. It explodes all over the place.
We have not had really access to a microwave in our office during COVID, but now the microwave is back, and we'll have to put up a sign: no fish in the microwave, or you get sent to the bad place.
How about Hawaiian pizzas?
It's not my thing, but you do you with your Hawaiian pizza.
I mean, you lived in California. There must have been a lot of that kind of pineapple pizza thing. No, am I wrong?
I just, I have little kids. They eat cheese pizza, and definitely no like basil or anything like that. That's just cheese pizza.
And I was trying, is Manhattan clam chowder? Is that because they said the dining? Trevor said that on the dining car they had only Manhattan clam chowder at the dining car, and it's closed.
Yeah, being a kosher person, I'm not like up on my clam chowder, but I will say that last year my son, there's a lot of oysters in the Hudson River now, and they're being
Ah,
used from an environmental perspective. Apparently, they do something to clean the Hudson River, and so you have all of these Jewish kids going down to the Hudson River to study oysters, which are shellfish. And it's like, so that was pretty funny. But apparently, they do a lot of good for the environment. I know oysters and clams are not the same. Audience, don't come for me, which I'm not on. I don't know what Manhattan clam chowder is. Maybe it's just clams you fished out of the East River, which would be a very big mistake.
perhaps this will be a listener challenge to figure that out. I do like fish chowder. It was actually the my first major kitchen mistake was trying to make some fish chowder in my small
In the
apartment.
microwave?
No, and actually not in the microwave, but it was in a pot in New York City in a small kitchen, and it exploded onto the ceiling. So that didn't harm anybody else. It just was a real pain to to clean up.
Sounds, yeah, well, Trevor really he has it down, but you know, it's as a very big fan of Parks and Rec, it's hard to look at Trevor and not think of Ben for Parks and Rec, who's a very lovely and lovable character. So it's just a little cognitive dissonance when if you're a fan of Parks and Rec and you then you look at Trevor and you think he's not a demon, he's a bureaucrat from Pawnee, Indiana.
See, that's so interesting because I looked at him, having not really watched much Parks and Rec, and he immediately looks to me like not just the part of Trevor, but he, I think, almost frightens me. He must be pushing some teenage button in me because I just think, oh, this is like someone not someone who is in my social circle exactly, but like I feel like adjacent to, and who I could see that exactly that person having made my life miserable in some way. Fortunately, there's no one out there I can name and say Trevor's reminding me of you. Not that I would name you on the on the podcast if I could think of it.
No, well, okay, well, if you don't watch Parks and Rec, after you're done with The Good Place, go to Parks and Rec. It's not it's just as brilliant as The Good Place, but it's a different kind of show. And Adam Scott is great on that show, and he's great on this show. So
So let's see. Do we have anything else here?
I think one other thing that stood out is at the end, Eleanor says, "This whole good bad system is bullshit," right? And I think that's actually a lot of what Jews think about on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Like, really, this is what we're all going to synagogue for, to be like tallied up and go in the book of life, or the book of death, the bad book, right? Like there should, as you said, there should be a medium place. So I liked that line. This the whole good bad system is bullshit. And then I'm sure you'll get into this with whoever you're talking to about episode 9, but the real Eleanor coming out, and I think it's one thing to think in abstract, oh, I got sent to the wrong place, and it's another thing, and maybe this brings us back full circle to the beginning, to be like faced with the person who is suffering because you are in one place and they are in another place, right? It's the theory that if you see like if you learn the story of one starving child, you're much more likely to help than if you hear a statistic about 1 million starving children. And so to sort of see the real Eleanor come off the train and be faced with her, it opens up all kinds of interesting moral quandaries. Like at that moment, at least I really felt like, oh God, it's really bad actually that Kristen Bell Eleanor is in the good place and this other Eleanor is suffering because of it.
Yeah, there's so much. I like how this episode is, reweaves some of these threads. Even this issue of the title, "The Most Improved Player," which kind of pulls back again this whole issue of whether we judge someone according to some absolute scale versus kind of their own growth or their own nature, and then this question of does the good bad system really work and describe everything, and what you're saying is my yeah, I guess the earlier part of the story is, is Eleanor's destiny kind of tied to the horrible group of roommates, or this like better group of good place things, and now this other person. Yeah, it throws a lot of that into the mix and just sort of stirs the pot on things we've been talking about before. Is that a real life situation at all where I could see there's competitions for like things where there's only room for one.
Maybe not as dramatically as in the Good Place, but sure, there's lots of things where you do something and by extension somebody else can't do it. Hopefully nobody is out there directly suffering because of something that I did or a mistake that I made, but I am open to the idea that it's possible.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing is like, I got this job and somebody else didn't. It's funny, actually. Now I don't know if we'll keep this in. I have often thought that like what I would love to do actually is to teach like introduction to ethical philosophy at a community college. And then I realized, wait a minute, I have a job, and there are people who like won't have a job. Like if I get that adjunct, one class in introduction to ethical philosophy, like somebody who that's actually their career can't have that job, and that's a living for them, and for me it would be fulfilling if I could add that. So maybe that's for me, where this shows up. Well, thank you again, Rebecca, for coming by and having this conversation.
Thanks for having me. This was really fun, and it's a nice way to spend the afternoon thinking about the Good Place.
And that's all for another episode of Tove. Thank you for listening. We've got show notes at tovegoodplace.com. Subscribe to Tove on your app of choice and help others find us by giving us a good rating or writing a review or sharing on social media. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Tove Goodplace. Watch for our next episode with Ben Gurin and Myra Meskin, two rabbis with a baby they named Eleanor. Thanks again for making our conversation a part of your day. And to riff on Mark Evan Jackson from the official Good Place podcast, now go learn more about something good.
Bum, 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 bum.